Sir Francis Drake's legacy changed England forever. Everything Drake and John Hawkins raided and plundered from Spain resulted in England becoming arguably the richest and most wealthy country in the world, therefore helping them overcome future obstacles that they would later face. For example, it helped them win the war against King Philip II and the Spanish Armada, which prevented Spain from conquering England. All of this was possible because Drake was commander in the war and because Queen Elizabeth I financed all of Drake's expeditions, including his voyage around the world. His legacy lived on forever. All of his accomplishments would have not occurred unless Drake was born. He was born on the Crowndale farm in Devonshire in southwestern England in the spring of 1540. He was in a poor family fighting through poverty. His father was a Protestant preacher who didn't accumulate enough money to assist his family. Once Drake turned 13, he was shipped off to a cargo ship to help his family get out of poverty. He learned many valuable sailing skills on the ship. When the owner of the ship died, Drake sold it for money to settle in Plymouth, which he did. After he reached Plymouth, he met up with John Hawkins, who was his cousin, and the rest of John's family. John Hawkins educated Drake on everything he knew about piracy. By the time Drake was finally prepared to set sail with Hawkins, he was an officer under him during his slave trading expeditions. During these voyages, Hawkins traveled to Africa to pick up slaves and sailed to the West Indies to sell them, which gave him great sums of money, which he then returned to England. Then the cycle continued. Eventually the expeditions were seized when the Spanish caught the English fleet taking port in San Juan de Ulua. After the conflict, only a few ships remained, which Hawkins and Drake escaped on. This was the official end of the slave trading expeditions. After the slave trading expeditions, Drake became the commander of many ships that raided Spanish ships and settlements. He asked permission from Queen Elizabeth I to sail to the Spanish settlements, but she refused to finance the expedition, though he decided to defy the Queen anyways, which was something that takes a lot of courage, and he began his voyage anyways. The expedition went exactly as planned, and was hugely successful. Although the last voyage was very successful, in 1572, Drake was hungry to set sail once again. Even though it was difficult, he returned to England with what would now be $5 million today in gold, goods, valuables, and very precious metals. Drake's most famous expedition was the circumnavigation of the globe. It was only the second time that someone was able to accomplish this feat in history, and Drake was the first Englishman to do so, only behind Magellan. Shortly after his previous voyage, Drake was flocked by investors that wanted him to sail around the world. So he did. The expedition was kept a secret to ensure that it would be a success. They had the best ships that money could buy, the rulers of the seas. The Pelican, the Elizabeth, the Marigold, the Swallow, the Swan, the Benedict, and the best ship of the century, the Golden Hind, which led the entire fleet. On December 13th, 1577, the voyage began. At their first stop, Santiago, they left without gaining any wealth. At Grava, they encountered a rocky coastline, just barely surviving the encounter. As they continued to sail towards the Strait of Magellan, they stumbled upon Thomas Doughty, the man who put Drake's brother in jail. After Doughty attempted to revolt against Drake, he was executed for mutiny. Once they entered the Strait of Magellan, their supplies were nearly depleted, and by the time they had discovered 3 native islands, the only ships left were the Swan, the Mary, and the Golden Hind. On the way back, they came upon several storms, which destroyed the Swan and the Mary, therefore making the Golden Hind the only ship to return after a 3-year expedition around the world. This capped off one of the most monumental voyages in English history. After sailing through the Indian Ocean and back around Africa, the Englishmen were ready to go back home. The journey had taken about 3 years, and the Golden Hind, which was the only ship that made it back, was battered. Because the crew had been on the Golden Hind for several years, they had no idea what to expect when they arrived home. They lacked any sort of communication, so they didn't know if Spain had taken control of England or if any other significant events had occurred. By the time Drake returned, the early stages of the war against Spain had begun. Drake also told Queen Elizabeth everything that had happened. Queen Elizabeth rewarded him with many riches, and he returned the favor. In 1581, Sir Francis Drake was knighted by Queen Elizabeth. Eventually, word of Drake's discovery spread through England and became one of England's most well-known figures and one of the wealthiest as well. The war against the Spanish Armada was the most significant turning point of the time and one of the largest ever in English history. Queen Elizabeth had just aided the Dutch rebellion, which enraged King Philip of Spain. In 1587, he decided to send an armada against England. He placed the Duke of Medina in command of the fleet, and the Spanish ships set off. He sent 130 combat vessels carrying nearly 30,000 men. The fleet that was intended to invade and conquer England was led by 20 galleons. The Spanish fleet traveled into the English Channel on July 31st and encountered the English fleet waiting for them. The English fleet consisted of about 150 vessels, which were led by about 20 galleons. The fleet was split into individual groups, which were commanded by Sir Francis Drake, Sir John Hawkins, Martin Frobisher, and a couple others. The English fleet used the tactic of firing cannons and waging conflict from a distance, while the Spanish fleet attempted to close in on the English ships and board. Both fleets became exhausted, but eventually the Spanish retreated to the North Sea on August 9th. Only about 65 damaged Spanish ships remained, which carried 9,000 sick and dying men. Almost nothing remained unscathed. The defeat of the Spanish Armada was an enormous victory for England that may have affected the result of the war against Spain. His later years led to his death, which was a huge tragedy to England. Queen Elizabeth desired to place Spain permanently out of commission. The clever and daring plot was to seize Spain's wealth and therefore causing a collapse of the empire. Lethally sick, Sir Francis Drake voyaged to commandeer King Philip II's riches. Unfortunately, he concealed his dreadful illness from the crew and those close to him. The world suffered a great loss when the funeral bells announced his death. He passed away on January 28, 1596, when a vicious fever snatched his life. His lead coffin was lowered into the infinite blue ocean. Every soul who was able to attend his funeral wished him a formal farewell. And therefore, after decades of death-defying adventures and revolutionary discoveries, the renowned sea captain had finally succumbed to the fever. England was forever altered because of what Drake had accomplished, discovered, and pillaged. Riches and gold were what England obtained while dealing with Drake and Hawkins. Precious riches also flowed steadily to Queen Elizabeth I. Both of these valuable goods ensured that England would flourish and become a force that nobody can compete with. Along with the funding of Her Majesty, this ambitious knight was the second person ever to circumnavigate the globe. War explosively erupted between England and Spain, but Sir Francis Drake ascended through the ranks and assisted in protecting Her Majesty's land. Drake's entire life was a turning point in the history of England and in the history of the entire world.